The signal cut through static like a knife through fog. Inside a cramped bunker near Anzio, Italy, February 1944, Lieutenant Colonel Mike Davidson pressed his headphones tighter against his ears. What he was hearing should have been impossible. German artillery coordinates, crystal clear, real time, broadcasting on frequencies the enemy thought were secure. "Sir, you need to hear this," whispered Sergeant Tony Rodriguez. The radio operator who'd first picked up the transmission, his hands shook as he adjusted the frequency dial. "It's coming through on multiple bands, and it's in perfect English." Davidson grabbed the headphones. The voice was calm, methodical, almost casual. "Battery 7, target grid, 347892, infantry concentration, fire for effect." A pause. Then coordinates for another position. Then another. 3 minutes later. German shells began falling exactly where the mysterious broadcaster had predicted. But they weren't falling on Allied positions. They were hitting German supply lines, communication posts, and reserve positions with devastating accuracy. Someone was inside the German communications network. Someone was listening to everything. And someone was turning Germany's own artillery against itself. The impossible was happening in real time, broadcast from somewhere behind enemy lines by equipment that officially didn't exist. Equipment built by a man the army had rejected, using methods no engineering manual taught, solving problems military experts claimed couldn't be solved. This was February 1944. The Allied invasion of Italy had stalled into brutal attrition warfare. Every advance cost hundreds of lives. Artillery dominated the battlefield, and whoever could call it faster and more accurately held the advantage. The Germans had that advantage. Their communications were encrypted, their frequencies secure, their coordination superior. Until now. The voice continued broadcasting German artillery plans in real time, turning the enemy's greatest strength into their greatest vulnerability. Somewhere in occupied territory, a device that shouldn't exist was intercepting signals that couldn't be intercepted, operated by a man who'd been told his ideas were impossible. 6 months earlier, in a Pentagon briefing room thick with cigarette smoke, General Harold Mitchell slammed a folder onto the mahogany table. "Gentlemen, we have a communications crisis that's costing us the war." The assembled officers studied reconnaissance photos scattered across the table, burned out Allied radio trucks, destroyed communication posts, silent artillery batteries that couldn't coordinate fire support. "The Germans have perfected battlefield communications interception," Mitchell continued. "They're listening to everything. Our frequencies, our codes, our tactical coordination. Every time we transmit, they triangulate our position and destroy our equipment within minutes." Colonel James Patterson, Chief of Army Communications, leaned forward. "Sir, we've tried everything. Frequency hopping, burst transmission, high directional antennas. The Germans counter every innovation within weeks. Their detection equipment is simply superior." The statistics were devastating. Allied communication units suffered 300% higher casualty rates than any other branch. Artillery coordination had become nearly impossible. Infantry advances failed because supporting fire couldn't be directed effectively. The German ability to intercept and locate radio transmissions was strangling Allied operations. "Well, what about the British solutions?" asked Colonel Davidson. Patterson shook his head grimly. "They're facing the same problems. Their latest encrypted radio system lasted 3 days before German direction-finding equipment started targeting it. RAF bomber losses spiked 400% when the Germans began intercepting navigation frequencies." The room fell silent. This wasn't just a technical problem, it was an existential threat. Modern warfare depended on communications. Artillery needed coordinates. Infantry needed air support. Tanks needed logistics coordination. Without secure communications, military operations became chaos. "We've consulted every major university engineering department," Patterson continued. MIT, Stanford, Bell Labs. The consensus is unanimous. Secure, real-time battlefield communications against German interception technology is theoretically impossible with current equipment. General Mitchell stood slowly, all theoretically impossible. That's what our best minds tell us about the one thing we need most to win this war. What they didn't know was that 800 miles away, in a converted barn workshop in rural Kansas, a farmer named Edwin Armstrong was proving their experts wrong. Using equipment he'd built from scrap metal and radio parts ordered through Sears' catalog, Armstrong had already solved the impossible problem. Edwin Armstrong wiped grease from his hands with a torn rag, squinting at the maze of vacuum tubes and copper wire spread across his workbench. Outside his converted barn workshop, Kansas wheat fields stretched to the horizon. Inside, he was building something the Pentagon's best engineers claimed couldn't exist. At 34, Armstrong looked more like a mechanic than a revolutionary. Calloused hands, work boots, flannel shirt rolled to the elbows. He'd never attended college, never worked for a major corporation, never published a scientific paper, but he understood radio frequencies the way other men understood the weather, instinctively, completely, personally. "Edwin, supper!" his wife Martha called from the farmhouse. He barely heard her. For 6 months, he'd been working 18-hour days on a project that consumed every spare moment and dollar. His neighbors thought he'd lost his mind, building radio contraptions instead of farming. The breakthrough had come 3 weeks ago. While experimenting with frequency modulation techniques, Armstrong discovered something extraordinary. By rapidly shifting between multiple frequencies in a seemingly random pattern, synchronized between transmitter and receiver, he could create communications that were virtually undetectable to conventional intercept equipment. The Germans were masters at finding radio signals because they knew what to look for: consistent carrier frequencies, predictable transmission patterns, fixed antenna positions. Armstrong's system eliminated all of those vulnerabilities. It frequency hopped so rapidly that intercept equipment couldn't lock onto the signal. To anyone listening, it sounded like random static. But Armstrong knew the military would never listen to a Kansas farmer with wild ideas about radio technology. He needed credibility, official channels, proper presentation. On August 15, 1943, he typed a letter to the War Department describing his frequency-hopping communication system and requesting a meeting to demonstrate the technology. The response arrived 3 weeks later, a form letter thanking him for his patriotic interest and explaining that all communications research was handled by qualified engineers at established institutions. His proposal would be filed for future reference. Armstrong crumpled the letter and threw it into his workshop's wood stove. He'd expected rejection, but it still stung. While he was being dismissed by bureaucrats, American soldiers were dying because their radios betrayed their positions to German artillery. That night, he made a decision that would change the course of the war. If the army wouldn't come to him, he'd go to the battlefield. Somehow, he'd get his equipment to soldiers who needed it most. The Pentagon experts could keep claiming his solution was impossible. He'd prove them wrong with results. Armstrong's breakthrough came from an unlikely source: his grandmother's quilting pattern. Sitting in his workshop late one October evening, frustrated by synchronization problems, he noticed the seemingly random but perfectly ordered design of her double wedding ring quilt hanging on the wall. Random to an outsider, but perfectly predictable if you know the pattern, he muttered, studying the interlocking rings. That was exactly what his frequency hopping system needed: apparent randomness with hidden order. He spent the next month developing what he called the Armstrong sequence, a mathematical pattern that appeared random but could be precisely replicated by properly synchronized equipment. His transmitter would jump between 47 different frequencies in a specific order, spending only milliseconds on each frequency before moving to the next. The beauty was elegant simplicity. To German intercept operators, The transmission would sound like brief bursts of static across multiple frequencies, background noise in a radio spectrum filled with interference. But a receiver programmed with the identical sequence could follow the frequency hops perfectly, reconstructing clear audio from the scattered signal fragments. By November, Armstrong had built 3 working prototypes. The transmitter fit into a standard military backpack. The receiver was no larger than a conventional field radio. Both units used synchronized clockwork mechanisms, modified alarm clock movements, to control the frequency hopping. No exotic materials, no advanced electronics, just clever engineering using readily available components. Testing proved the system's revolutionary potential. Armstrong could transmit clear voice communications across 20 miles with zero detectability on conventional monitoring equipment. He positioned his neighbor, Tom Mitchell, a Great War veteran, 5 miles away with a standard German-style direction-finding radio. Despite knowing the transmission schedule and approximate location, Mitchell couldn't intercept a single word. "Edwin, this is impossible," Mitchell reported after hours of unsuccessful attempts. "I can hear faint static bursts, but nothing coherent. If I didn't know you were transmitting, I'd assume it was atmospheric interference." Armstrong grinned. That was exactly the point. His system was invisible to conventional detection methods because it violated every assumption about how radio communications worked. Instead of broadcasting on one frequency continuously, it scattered the signal across dozens of frequencies for such brief intervals that conventional equipment couldn't track the pattern. But the real test would be battlefield conditions. Armstrong needed to get his equipment to combat zones, into the hands of soldiers facing life-or-death communication challenges. He couldn't go through official channels. The Pentagon had already dismissed him. He needed another approach. The solution came from an unexpected source. His brother-in-law, Staff Sergeant Robert "Dutch" Hansen, was home on leave from the European theatre. Dutch had served with communication units in North Africa and Italy, had seen firsthand how German interception was devastating Allied operations. "Dutch, I need you to do something that might get us both court-martialed," Armstrong said, leading his brother-in-law into the workshop. "But it might also save a lot of American lives." Staff Sergeant Dutch Hansen stared at Armstrong's radio equipment like it was a live rattlesnake. "Edwin, you want me to smuggle unauthorized radio gear into a combat zone? Do you understand what they do to soldiers who compromise communication security?" Armstrong connected the prototype transmitter to a car battery. "Dutch, what they're doing now isn't working. How many communication units got wiped out in Italy because the Germans tracked their transmissions?" Dutch's face darkened. "And too many. My buddy Jerry Morrison's entire radio section got hit by artillery 3 minutes after they started transmitting coordinates. 12 men dead because Jerry had to call in a medical evacuation." "This system is untrackable," Armstrong insisted. "Give me 5 minutes to prove it." Against his better judgment, Dutch agreed to help test the equipment. They drove to opposite ends of the county, Dutch with the receiver, Armstrong with the transmitter. For 3 hours, Armstrong broadcast continuously, while Dutch tried to locate the transmission source using standard Army direction-finding techniques. Dutch couldn't find him. More importantly, he couldn't even detect the transmission unless his receiver was synchronized to the frequency hopping sequence. To anyone with conventional equipment, Armstrong was invisible. 2 weeks later, Dutch returned to his unit in Italy carrying Armstrong's prototype, concealed in his personal gear. The plan was simple: test the system under actual combat conditions, demonstrate its effectiveness to field commanders, and create demand that would force Pentagon bureaucrats to pay attention. The first test was a disaster. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Tex Morrison, Dutch's commanding officer, confiscated the equipment immediately. "Hansen, what the hell is this unauthorized radio gear? Did you steal this from Signal Corps?" "Sir, it's a prototype communication system that can't be intercepted by German." "Sergeant, I don't care if it can communicate with Mars. Unauthorized radio equipment in a combat zone is a court-martial offense. This equipment is impounded pending investigation. The prototype disappeared into a military bureaucracy warehouse. Dutch faced disciplinary action for introduction of unauthorized technical equipment. Armstrong's breakthrough technology was labeled experimental contraband and scheduled for destruction. But Morrison's radio operator, Corporal Anthony Tony Rodriguez, had observed Dutch's demonstration before the confiscation. Rodriguez was a former electronics technician from Detroit, and he understood what he'd witnessed. That night, he approached Dutch privately. "Sarge, I saw what that radio did, the frequency patterns, the hopping sequence. That's revolutionary technology. My cousin works at Ford's radio division, and they've been trying to solve German interception problems for 2 years. Rodriguez had an idea. What if we rebuilt the system using standard Army components? No unauthorized equipment, just creative reassembly of authorized radio parts. It was technically legal. Soldiers regularly modified equipment for better performance. If they could recreate Armstrong's frequency hopping system using existing Army radios, they might bypass the bureaucratic obstacles that had blocked the original prototype." Working in secret after duty hours, Rodriguez and Dutch began cannibalizing damaged radio equipment. They needed clockwork timing mechanisms, frequency control circuits, and signal processing components. Most importantly, they needed to reverse engineer Armstrong's mathematical sequence without the original documentation. After 2 weeks of covert engineering, they had a crude but functional frequency hopping system built entirely from Army surplus parts. It looked like standard military equipment, used authorized components, and produced the same impossible results as Armstrong's original design. The question was whether anyone would listen long enough to understand what they'd accomplished. Colonel James Patterson's voice crackled through the field telephone with barely contained fury. "Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, explain to me why unauthorized radio experiments are being conducted in your sector without proper authorization." Morrison gripped the handset tighter. Watching Rodriguez and Dutch hastily disconnect their frequency hopping equipment, someone had reported their covert testing to higher command. "Sir, my communications section was conducting field modifications to improve operational effectiveness." "Field modifications?" Patterson's laugh was harsh. "I have reports of your unit transmitting on unauthorized frequencies using unregistered equipment configurations. That's not modification, Morrison. That's insubordination." The crackdown was swift and comprehensive. Within 48 hours, military intelligence officers arrived to confiscate all modified radio equipment. Rodriguez and Dutch were separated and interrogated individually about their unauthorized technical activities. Their frequency-hopping radios were dismantled and shipped to Pentagon communications laboratories for security analysis. The official report was damning. Field personnel have attempted to develop independent communication systems without proper authorization or security clearance. Such unauthorized innovation represents a serious breach of communication security protocols and could compromise Allied operational security. But the Pentagon investigators missed the crucial point. In their haste to suppress unauthorized innovation, they failed to actually test the frequency hopping system's capabilities. The confiscated equipment was analyzed for security violations, not for tactical effectiveness. Meanwhile, Armstrong received devastating news through back channels. His brother-in-law, Dutch, faced potential court-martial for introducing unauthorized equipment into a combat zone. Rodriguez was being transferred to a quartermaster unit, effectively ending his communications career. Is there more afraid of soldiers thinking independently than they are of losing the war? Armstrong told his wife Martha as he read Dutch's censored letter. The bureaucrats would rather follow failed procedures than try something that actually works. The institutional resistance ran deeper than simple bureaucracy. Army communications doctrine was built around centralized control, standardized equipment, and rigid procedures. Armstrong's frequency hopping system threatened that entire structure. If individual units could develop undetectable communications independently, it would undermine the military's chain of command and equipment standardization. General Mitchell himself weighed in during a Pentagon briefing. "Gentlemen, we cannot allow field personnel to develop communication systems independently. Today, it's frequency-hopping radios. Tomorrow it might be unauthorized encryption or unregistered signal protocols. Military effectiveness depends on standardization and central control." Armstrong's revolutionary technology was being suppressed not because it didn't work, but because it worked too well. It proved that conventional wisdom was wrong, that established procedures were inadequate, and that a Kansas farmer could solve problems the Pentagon's best engineers couldn't. But suppressing the technology didn't eliminate the underlying problem. German interception capabilities continued devastating Allied communications. Radio units suffered catastrophic casualties. Artillery coordination remained nearly impossible. The institutional resistance to Armstrong's solution was protecting bureaucratic authority while American soldiers died. In his Kansas workshop, Armstrong made a decision that would change everything. If official channels wouldn't accept his innovation, he'd find unofficial ones. Somewhere in the military hierarchy, someone would prioritize victory over procedure. Major General William Wild Bill Donovan had built the Office of Strategic Services on a simple principle: results mattered more than regulations. In his Washington office, surrounded by maps of occupied Europe, he studied the confiscated frequency-hopping radio with growing fascination. "Tell me again how this Kansas farmer's contraption works," Donovan said to Captain James Sullivan. His technical intelligence officer, Sullivan, pointed to the modified components. "Sir, it's brilliant in its simplicity. The system jumps between 47 different frequencies in a predetermined sequence. To German intercept equipment, it sounds like random static. But synchronized receivers can follow the pattern and reconstruct perfect audio." Donovan had acquired the confiscated equipment through unofficial channels after hearing rumors about impossible radio technology being suppressed by Army communications bureaucrats. Unlike Pentagon officials, Donovan wasn't interested in protecting institutional authority. He was interested in winning the war. "Have you tested it against German interception equipment?" Donovan asked. "We captured a complete German direction-finding station in Sicily last month," Sullivan replied. "I've been testing Armstrong's system against it for 2 weeks. The German equipment can't detect our transmissions at all. It's completely invisible to their intercept capabilities." That was exactly what Donovan wanted to hear. The OSS desperately needed secure communications for resistance operations behind enemy lines. Conventional radios were death traps. German triangulation teams could locate and destroy resistance radio operators within minutes of transmission. Armstrong's frequency hopping system could change everything. Within 48 hours, Donovan had authorization for a classified project: develop practical battlefield applications for frequency hopping communications technology. The project would bypass normal Army procurement channels, operating under OSS authority with unlimited resources and absolute secrecy. Armstrong received an unexpected visitor in early January 1944. Captain Sullivan arrived at the Kansas farm in civilian clothes, driving an unmarked car, carrying authorization that made Armstrong's head spin. "Mr. Armstrong, the United States government needs your help," Sullivan said simply. "How quickly can you build 50 frequency-hopping radio systems?" For the next month, Armstrong's barn workshop became a classified production facility. OSS technicians assisted with assembly while Armstrong refined his design for mass production. The clockwork timing mechanisms were replaced with more reliable electronic circuits. The frequency range was expanded to 73 channels. Most importantly, the mathematical sequence was enhanced with multiple pattern variations. "Different operations need different sequences," Armstrong explained to Sullivan as they tested the improved systems. "Resistance networks in France will use pattern alpha. Italian partisans get pattern beta. If one sequence is compromised, it won't affect other operations. The refined system exceeded everyone's expectations. Range increased to 35 miles. Audio quality improved dramatically. Most importantly, the equipment proved completely reliable under harsh field conditions. Armstrong had transformed his prototype into a robust, practical communication system ready for actual combat deployment. By February in 1944, the first operational frequency-hopping radios were being deployed to OSS teams infiltrating occupied Europe. The results were immediate and revolutionary. For the first time since the war began, Allied operatives could communicate securely behind enemy lines without fear of German direction finding. But the technology's greatest test was yet to come. In Italy, Corporal Rodriguez had been quietly reconstructing Armstrong's system using knowledge gained from his earlier experiments. This time, he had an ally who outranked Pentagon bureaucrats. February 22, 1944. The Allied beachhead at Anzio was collapsing. For 6 weeks, American and British forces had been trapped on a narrow strip of Italian coastline, surrounded by German artillery that could observe and target every movement. Conventional radio communications had become suicide missions. German direction-finding teams destroyed Allied radio positions within minutes of transmission. Lieutenant Colonel Mike Davidson crouched in his command bunker as 88mm shells exploded overhead. His communication situation was desperate. Artillery support required radio coordination, but every transmission brought immediate counter-battery fire. His radio operators had suffered 80% casualties in 3 days. "Sir, we've got to try something different," Corporal Rodriguez said, emerging from the smoking remains of his latest radio position. "Conventional communications are getting everyone killed." Rodriguez had been secretly rebuilding Armstrong's frequency hopping system using salvaged parts from destroyed radios. Working in bomb craters during artillery barrages, he'd assembled a crude but functional prototype. It looked like a pile of electronic junk held together with combat wire and prayer. "Rodriguez, I don't care if you've built a radio that talks to God," Davidson replied grimly. "If it can coordinate artillery support without getting us all killed, I'll recommend you for the Medal of Honor." At 0300 hours, Rodriguez made the first frequency-hopping transmission from the Anzio beachhead. The message was simple: "Firebird Base, this is Anvil 6, radio check, over." The response came immediately, crystal clear. "Anvil 6, this is Firebird Base, reading you 5 by 5. How are you transmitting?" "We show no radio activity on conventional frequencies." For the next hour, Rodriguez coordinated artillery fire missions using the frequency hopping system. German direction-finding teams frantically searched for the transmission source, but their equipment detected only random static bursts. American artillery began hitting German positions with devastating accuracy while remaining completely invisible to enemy intercept. But the real breakthrough came at dawn. German artillery observers, frustrated by their inability to locate American radio transmissions, began using their own communications more frequently to coordinate counter-battery fire. Rodriguez discovered his frequency-hopping receiver could intercept German transmissions across multiple frequency bands simultaneously. "Sir, you need to hear this," Rodriguez said, handing Davidson the headphones. German artillery coordinates were broadcasting in real time: target locations, ammunition types, firing schedules, everything the Americans needed to anticipate and counter German artillery attacks. Within 6 hours, the tactical situation at Anzio had completely reversed. American artillery, guided by intercepted German communications, began systematically destroying enemy positions. German commanders, unable to locate American radio transmissions, couldn't coordinate effective counterattacks. The frequency hopping system had achieved something impossible. It had turned Germany's communication superiority into a catastrophic vulnerability. Armstrong's invention didn't just provide secure Allied communications, it made Allied forces invisible while simultaneously exposing German operations. But success brought new dangers. Pentagon communications officials, learning about unauthorized radio operations at Anzio, ordered immediate cessation of all experimental communication activities. General Mitchell personally radioed Davidson with explicit instructions. All unauthorized radio equipment will be confiscated immediately. Any personnel involved in unauthorized communications activities will face court-martial proceedings. Davidson faced an impossible choice. Orders from higher command demanded he stop using the only communication system that was keeping his forces alive. But abandoning frequency-hopping communications would return his unit to the catastrophic vulnerability that had nearly destroyed the Anzio beachhead. At 1800 hours, with German artillery preparing a massive bombardment that conventional communications couldn't coordinate a defense against, Davidson made the decision that would define his career. "Rodriguez, continue transmitting," Davidson ordered, his voice steady despite the court-martial he was risking. "I'd rather face a Pentagon tribunal than explain to dead soldiers' families why I followed orders that got them killed." February 23rd, 0600 hours. The German offensive began with the heaviest artillery barrage in the Italian campaign. Over 200 guns concentrated fire on the Anzio perimeter, attempting to crush Allied resistance before launching a massive infantry assault. It should have been a massacre. Instead, it became Germany's worst tactical disaster in Italy. Rodriguez's frequency-hopping system intercepted every German fire mission in real time. Battery 4, target grid 445-6667, preparatory fire, 30 rounds high, explosive, the intercepted transmissions revealed. American counter-battery fire began falling on German positions before their own shells finished impacting Allied lines. But this is impossible. German artillery commander Major Klaus Weber radioed to his headquarters. "American counter-battery fire is anticipating our missions. They're hitting our guns while we're still adjusting coordinates." The frequency-hopping advantage was devastating and complete. German artillery, their primary tactical superiority, had become a liability. Every transmission revealed their positions to Americans who remained completely invisible. Within 4 hours, 60% of German artillery around Anzio was destroyed or abandoned. But the ultimate validation came when German infantry launched their assault. Conventional Allied communications would have made coordinated defense impossible. Radio transmissions would have been intercepted and targeted immediately. Armstrong's system allowed seamless coordination between American artillery, British air support, and French infantry. "Hawkeye leader, this is Anvil 6, Davidson transmitted. His frequency-hopping radio completely undetectable to German intercept. Enemy infantry advancing grid 334-445, request immediate close air support. Anvil 6, Hawkeye leader, we have visual, beginning attack, run." The German assault collapsed within 3 hours. Superior Allied coordination, made possible by secure communications, overwhelmed German tactical advantages. For the first time since landing at Anzio, Allied forces began advancing rather than merely surviving. General Harold Alexander, commanding Allied forces in Italy, arrived at Davidson's headquarters that evening. He'd monitored the battle from his command post, watching impossible tactical coordination unfold through intercepted German communications that revealed American artillery striking targets the enemy hadn't even attacked yet. "Colonel Davidson, explain to me how your communications remained completely secure while simultaneously intercepting all German transmissions," Alexander demanded. Davidson led Alexander to Rodriguez's frequency-hopping installation. The general studied the cobbled-together equipment with growing amazement. "But this was built by an enlisted man using salvaged parts?" Alexander asked. "Sir, the original design came from a Kansas farmer named Edwin Armstrong," Davidson replied. "The Pentagon rejected his proposal 6 months ago." Alexander was silent for a long moment, processing the implications. A rejected civilian innovation built by an enlisted soldier from scrap metal, had achieved what the Army's best communications experts claimed was impossible. "Colonel, I'm countermanding all Pentagon orders regarding this equipment," Alexander said finally. "Whatever this farmer built, I want it in every Allied unit in Italy within 30 days. The Pentagon briefing room fell silent as General Alexander's report circulated among the assembled brass. Colonel Patterson, who had dismissed Armstrong's original proposal, stared at the tactical analysis with growing disbelief. 60% reduction in communication casualties, complete elimination of German artillery intercept, real-time interception of enemy communications. Patterson looked up from the document. "General, are you certain these results are accurate?" Alexander's response was ice-cold. "Colonel, I watched German artillery destroy itself because they couldn't locate American radio transmissions that were intercepting their every command. A Kansas farmer solved the communication problem your experts claimed was impossible. Within 48 hours, the Pentagon's attitude toward frequency-hopping technology underwent complete reversal. The same officials who had confiscated Armstrong's prototypes now demanded immediate mass production. General Mitchell, who had ordered the technology suppressed, personally telephoned Armstrong to apologize and request his assistance. "Mr. Armstrong, the United States Army formally requests your cooperation in expanding frequency-hopping communication technology," Mitchell said during their first conversation. "We're prepared to offer you any resources you need." Armstrong's response was characteristically blunt. "General, 6 months ago you told me my ideas were impossible. American soldiers died while you protected bureaucratic procedures. Now you want my help because someone proved you wrong." But Armstrong wasn't interested in vindication. He wanted results. Within a week, he'd relocated his entire operation to a classified facility outside Washington, D.C. Army engineers, the same experts who had dismissed his original proposal, now worked under his direction to refine and mass-produce frequency-hopping systems. The transformation was remarkable and humbling. MIT professors who had pronounced secure battlefield communications theoretically impossible studied Armstrong's mathematical sequences with grudging admiration. Bell Labs engineers, accustomed to leading communication innovation, found themselves implementing designs created by a farmer with an 8th-grade education. "The frequency-hopping principle violates every assumption we made about radio security," admitted Dr. Robert Chen, the MIT communications expert who had originally rejected Armstrong's proposal. We assumed German intercept technology was insurmountable. Armstrong proved that assumption wrong by changing the rules entirely. By April 1944, frequency-hopping radios were being deployed throughout the European theater. The results exceeded even optimistic predictions. Communication casualties dropped 90%. Artillery coordination improved dramatically. Most importantly, Allied forces gained unprecedented intelligence advantages by intercepting German communications that enemy forces assumed were secure. The psychological impact on German forces was devastating. Artillery units, suddenly vulnerable to precise counter-battery fire, became reluctant to engage Allied positions. Infantry coordination suffered when radio communications invited immediate Allied artillery response. German tactical doctrine, built around communication superiority, collapsed when that superiority vanished overnight. General Erwin Rommel, commanding German defenses in France, captured the enemy perspective in a letter to his wife. "Would the Americans have developed some form of invisible communication? Our intercept teams can no longer locate their radio transmissions, yet they seem to anticipate our every move. It is as if they can read our thoughts." Armstrong's rejected innovation had become Germany's nightmare and America's secret weapon. The farmer's homemade radio had evolved into the technology that would help win the war. Edwin Armstrong returned to his Kansas farm in September 1945, carrying a medal for merit personally presented by President Truman. The barn workshop where he'd developed frequency-hopping technology was now empty, its equipment long since transferred to military production facilities that had manufactured over 50,000 frequency-hopping radios by war's end. "He changed the course of history," Martha told her husband as they walked through wheat fields, golden in the autumn sun. "But doesn't that feel extraordinary?" Armstrong smiled, picking up a handful of Kansas soil. "I just solved a problem that needed solving." That's what farmers do. We figure out what works and ignore what doesn't. But Armstrong's legacy extended far beyond World War II. The frequency hopping principle he'd developed in a converted barn became the foundation for technologies that would transform civilian life. His mathematical sequences, refined by decades of research, became the basis for cellular telephone network, Wi-Fi communications, Bluetooth connectivity, and GPS satellite systems. The smartphone in your pocket uses frequency hopping technology Edwin Armstrong pioneered in 1943. Every time you make a wireless call, connect to the internet, or use GPS navigation, you're utilizing principles developed by a Kansas farmer who refused to accept that secure communications were impossible. The irony is profound. The Pentagon experts who dismissed Armstrong's ideas as theoretically impossible were using technologies based on his innovations within a decade. The cellular revolution, the internet age, the GPS-enabled world, all built on frequency-hopping foundations that military authorities had initially rejected as impractical fantasy. Armstrong never patented his frequency-hopping innovations, believing that technologies developed during wartime should benefit all humanity. That decision cost him millions in potential royalties, but ensured that his breakthrough would become freely available for civilian development. Modern military communications still use advanced versions of Armstrong's original concept. Special operations forces, deployed in the world's most dangerous regions, rely on frequency-hopping radios that trace their lineage directly to equipment built in a Kansas barn 8 decades ago. The deeper lesson transcends technology. Armstrong's story demonstrates how breakthrough innovations often come from outside established institutions, from individuals willing to challenge conventional wisdom and persistent bureaucracy. The same experts who pronounce problems impossible are frequently the ones most resistant to solutions that prove them wrong. Today, Armstrong's frequency-hopping principle secures trillions of dollars in financial transactions, protects personal communications for billions of people, and enables the connected world we take for granted. Every wireless device is a testament to a farmer's refusal to accept that the impossible couldn't become inevitable. The farmer's homemade radio didn't just become the Army's hidden weapon, it became the invisible foundation of modern civilization. And somewhere in Kansas, wheat still grows in the fields where Edwin Armstrong proved that impossible simply means not yet understood.